Friends, comrades, thank you for being here. Let me start with a simple but unsettling observation. Every time I dig deeper into the current state of our economy and politics, I discover that the reality is not just bad, it is way worse than I thought. And the danger is, if we keep underestimating the problem, we will keep underestimating what it will take to fix it. Let's begin with wages. We've been told for decades that if we just work hard, play by the rules, and stay loyal to our jobs, we'll get ahead. But the truth is, real wages for the vast majority of Americans have been stagnant since the 1970s. That means for over 40 years, the productivity of the American worker has skyrocketed, but the rewards of that productivity have gone almost entirely to the top. At first, I thought this was merely an economic imbalance, but looking closer, it's far worse. It is systemic theft, legitimized by policies crafted by and for the wealthiest minority. You may think inflation is a passing storm, or that debt is just a personal responsibility issue. No, inflation today is not a random accident. It's a mechanism through which corporations raise prices, protect profits, and shift the costs of crisis onto ordinary people. Household debt? It's not the result of families being bad with money. It's the inevitable outcome of an economic system that keeps wages flat while demanding people pay more for healthcare, education, housing, and everything else. I used to think of debt as just a symptom. But it's far worse. It has become the very business model of American capitalism. The political system doesn't just reflect this economic reality, it reinforces it. Politicians take campaign contributions from the very corporations exploiting us, then write laws to protect those corporations. The result is a vicious cycle. You thought the system was broken? No, it's functioning exactly as designed for them, not for us. And that realization is way worse than the narrative we've been fed, that a little reform here, a policy tweak there will set things right. Here's the good news, and it is the only silver lining I'll give you. History teaches us that when contradictions become this severe, when the pain of the majority outweighs the privileges of the few, change becomes not only possible, but inevitable. Workers around the world have risen up in moments like this before. They have built unions, movements, parties, and institutions that challenged entrenched power and won real victories. The only real question is whether we today will do the same or whether we will resign ourselves to despair. The story of wages in America is one of the most revealing and devastating truths about our economic system, and it is central to understanding why so many working people today feel a constant sense of pressure, exhaustion, and betrayal. For decades, we were told a very simple promise: work hard, be productive, and the rewards will follow. This promise, repeated by politicians, business leaders, and media outlets, became a foundational myth of the American dream. It reassured millions that their sacrifices, long hours, lost weekends, postponed retirements, would translate into better living standards for themselves and their families. But when we look closely at the numbers, at the historical trajectory of wages in relation to productivity, we discover something deeply unsettling. The promise was broken long ago, and the system has been running on that betrayal ever since. Productivity measures how much output workers generate per hour of labor. Since the mid-20th century, particularly after World War II, productivity in the United States grew rapidly. The economy expanded, industries modernized, and workers produced more goods and services than ever before. And for a while during the 1940s, 1950s, and into the 1960s, wages and productivity moved hand in hand. If workers produced more, they were paid more. That period, often romanticized as the golden age of American capitalism, saw rising living standards, the growth of a middle class, and a level of stability that many assumed would continue indefinitely. But beginning in the 1970s, that link between productivity and wages was severed. Productivity kept rising. Workers kept producing more, often thanks to technological advances, better machinery, and improved skills. Yet wages, adjusted for inflation, stopped growing at the same pace. In fact, for most workers, real wages flattened. The American worker was doing more, producing more, and contributing more to the wealth of the country, but they were no longer sharing fairly in the fruits of that contribution. Instead, the extra wealth created by their labor was siphoned upward, captured by the owners of businesses, by executives, and by shareholders. This shift was not an accident of history. It was the result of deliberate choices, policy decisions, corporate strategies, and political realignments. The weakening of labor unions beginning in the 1970s stripped workers of their ability to collectively demand higher wages and better conditions. Deregulation and free market ideology tilted the playing field toward corporations, allowing them to prioritize profits above all else. Tax policies increasingly favored the wealthy, enabling those at the top to keep more of what they extracted from the system. Trade agreements encouraged outsourcing and the threat of moving jobs abroad, which kept American workers in a constant state of fear and vulnerability. Each of these factors reinforced the same outcome: wages frozen for the majority, while the gains of rising productivity flowed upward to a shrinking elite. The implications of this wage productivity gap are profound. It explains why so many families today feel like they are running harder just to stay in the same place. Even though workers are generating unprecedented levels of wealth, they must rely on second jobs, longer hours, and debt to maintain basic living standards. It explains the rise of household debt as a survival strategy, as people use credit cards, mortgages, and student loans to fill the gap left by stagnant incomes. It explains the political anger and disillusionment across the country, as people sense that the system is rigged, that no matter how hard they work, they cannot get ahead. And yet, despite the evidence, we continue to hear stories about individual responsibility, about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, about the supposed laziness of workers. These narratives are designed to distract from the structural reality. It is not that workers fail to produce, it is that the system failed to reward them for what they produced. The data is clear, and it cuts across industries, professions, and regions. Whether in manufacturing, service, education, or healthcare, workers are doing more and more while receiving less and less in return. The result is a society where inequality becomes entrenched. A small minority at the top sees its wealth multiply at a staggering pace, while the majority lives paycheck to paycheck. This inequality is not just economic, it is political, cultural, and psychological. It shapes how people see themselves, how they relate to their work, and how they view the future. When a system consistently denies workers their fair share, it erodes trust, breeds resentment, and undermines the very idea that hard work is rewarded. In short, the story of stagnant wages versus rising productivity is not a technical detail buried in economic reports. It is the defining betrayal of modern American capitalism. It reveals a system that takes the labor of millions, multiplies its value, and then distributes the rewards upward, away from the people who created it. It is a story not just of economics, but of power, who has it, how they use it, and how they maintain it. And until that imbalance is confronted, workers will continue to experience the same reality, working harder, producing more, but never getting ahead. Inflation is one of those economic terms that most people encounter not in textbooks, but in the grocery aisle, at the gas pump, or when opening their monthly bills. It describes the general rise in prices, the way the same dollar buys less over time. For ordinary families, it is experienced as a steady erosion of purchasing power, a slow but relentless tightening of the household budget. What is often left out of mainstream discussions, however, is the crucial point that inflation is not a random event, not an unavoidable force of nature. It is shaped by decisions, by corporations, by policymakers, and by those with the power to influence markets. To understand inflation today, we must look past the surface explanations and see it as a deliberate mechanism that enables corporations to preserve and expand profits while shifting the burden of crisis onto ordinary people. Take the period following the COVID-19 pandemic as an example. Supply chains were disrupted, labor markets shifted, and uncertainty rippled through the economy. Prices began to rise, but not simply because goods were scarce or shipping containers were stuck at ports. Major corporations in sectors from energy to food to retail seized the opportunity to raise prices far beyond what increased costs could justify. They called it pricing power, a sanitized phrase that masks what it really is: profiteering. Executives on earnings calls boasted to investors that they had successfully raised prices and expanded profit margins, even as millions of families struggled to afford basic necessities. Inflation became, in this sense, less a story of scarcity and more a story of power, the power of corporations to dictate prices in markets where consumers had little choice but to pay. The standard narrative we often hear suggests that inflation is caused by workers demanding too much or by government spending spiraling out of control. These claims serve a purpose. They shift blame away from the institutions that actually benefit from inflation. Workers did not suddenly receive massive wage increases in recent years. Real wages, in fact, lagged behind inflation. Government spending, while significant in the wake of the pandemic, was dwarfed by the scale of private sector profiteering. Yet the narrative of excess demand or reckless spending allows those at the top to frame inflation as everyone's fault but their own, thereby justifying policies like raising interest rates, which slow the economy, increase unemployment, and inflict further pain on ordinary households. This framing has historical precedent. In the 1970s, the U.S. experienced what came to be called stagflation, a combination of high inflation and stagnant growth. The mainstream story blamed oil shocks, unions, and government mismanagement. But beneath that story lay a shift in corporate strategy and political ideology. Businesses and policymakers began to use inflation as a justification for weakening labor's power. By portraying rising wages as the driver of inflation, they justified anti-union legislation, attacks on collective bargaining, and the adoption of monetary policies that prioritized the stability of capital over the security of workers. Inflation became not just an economic challenge, but a political weapon. Fast forward to today, and the same dynamics are at play. Corporations with monopolistic or oligopolistic power can raise prices without fear of losing customers, because in essential markets, energy, housing, healthcare, food, there are no real alternatives. Families cannot choose to stop heating their homes, paying rent, or buying groceries. This lack of choice enables corporations to pass along costs, pad their margins, and use inflation as a cover for accumulation. Shareholders benefit, executives collect bonuses, and the cycle continues. Meanwhile, households are told to tighten their belts and cut back, as though personal frugality could solve a systemic issue rooted in corporate power. The human impact of this process is profound. When inflation rises, wages almost never keep pace. Paychecks stretch thinner, forcing families to make painful decisions about what to cut, whether to skip a medical appointment, delay paying a bill, or take on additional debt. Savings are depleted, futures are mortgaged, and stress levels soar. Inflation becomes, in practice, a transfer of wealth. The working and middle classes pay more for the basics of life, while those at the top, who control the corporations setting prices, reap higher profits. What gets presented as an abstract percentage increase in the consumer price index is actually a redistribution of resources upward. The political dimension of inflation cannot be ignored. When corporations raise prices, they are not merely responding to market forces, they are exercising power. And when governments respond by raising interest rates rather than confronting profiteering, they are making a political choice to protect capital rather than workers. Central banks rarely admit this openly, but their policies consistently reveal the priority of defending financial stability over human stability. If inflation were truly treated as a crisis of profiteering, the response would look very different. Price controls in key sectors, stronger regulation of monopolies, and public investment in alternatives that break corporate dominance. Instead, the dominant approach punishes borrowers, homeowners, and small businesses while leaving corporate profits largely untouched. Understanding inflation in this way changes the entire conversation. It is not a mysterious economic cycle that punishes everyone equally. It is a reflection of inequality, a symptom of a system where those with the power to set prices use that power to enrich themselves. Inflation is therefore not only an economic issue, but a moral one, a question of who bears the cost of crisis and who benefits from it. And as long as the public is persuaded to believe that inflation is simply an unfortunate accident, the profiteering at its core will continue unchecked. Debt has long been framed as a matter of personal responsibility, the result of individuals living beyond their means or failing to manage their finances wisely. This framing is not only misleading, it is deliberately misleading. It shifts the blame for rising levels of household debt away from the structure of the economic system and onto the shoulders of individuals who are, in reality, responding to conditions that give them little choice. Debt today is not primarily the result of recklessness. It has become a built-in feature of American capitalism, a business model through which households are compelled to borrow in order to survive, while banks, lenders, and corporations reap enormous profits from that dependence. To see how this works, consider the relationship between wages and the cost of living. For decades, wages for the vast majority of workers have been stagnant, barely moving in real terms since the 1970s. At the same time, the costs of essential goods and services, healthcare, housing, education, childcare, have risen dramatically. Families are therefore caught in a vice. On one side, their paychecks no longer stretch as far. On the other, the necessities of life grow more expensive with each passing year. This gap between what people earn and what they must pay is not filled by sudden wage growth or by meaningful government support. It is filled with credit cards, student loans, mortgages, and personal loans. Debt in this way becomes the mechanism by which households keep functioning in an economy that does not reward their labor adequately. The education system offers one of the starkest examples. In the mid 20th century, public universities were affordable, often close to free, because higher education was understood as a public good. But over time, funding was slashed, tuition soared, and students were told that if they wanted a chance at a stable future, they would have to borrow. Today, millions of young people begin their adult lives burdened with tens of thousands of dollars in student debt, a debt that shapes every decision they make, whether to buy a home, start a family, or take a certain job. What was once an investment in society's future became a profitable industry for private lenders, banks, and even the federal government itself. Debt here is not an unfortunate byproduct, but a central design. Housing tells a similar story. Rising real estate prices, driven by speculation and financialization, have put home ownership out of reach for many families. Renters, meanwhile, face relentless increases as landlords take advantage of tight markets. To secure a home, many people are forced to take on mortgages that bind them to decades of payments, enriching banks through interest. Even those who cannot buy are often trapped by rental debt, as missing a single payment can lead to eviction, homelessness, or a permanent mark on their credit record. Again, debt becomes the price of accessing something as basic as shelter. Healthcare may be the most tragic arena in which this dynamic plays out. In most advanced economies, healthcare is treated as a right and financed collectively. In the United States, it remains a commodity. Medical costs are so high that even insured families face crippling bills. A sudden illness or emergency can wipe out savings and plunge households into medical debt. The cruelty of this system is that people do not choose to fall ill. They are forced into debt simply to survive. For hospitals, insurers, and pharmaceutical companies, however, this debt is revenue, a steady stream of payments that turn human vulnerability into profit. When we look at these examples together, the pattern is undeniable. Debt has become the substitute for wages, the patch that keeps households afloat while corporations keep pay suppressed and costs high. But it is more than a patch, it is a business model. Banks and lenders thrive on interest payments. Corporations thrive on financing schemes that lock consumers into long-term obligations. Even governments benefit from the illusion of prosperity sustained by debt-fueled consumption. The result is an economy where household indebtedness is not a sign of failure, but a sign of systemic design. The psychological impact of this arrangement is enormous. Individuals are made to feel ashamed of their debt, to internalize the idea that they are irresponsible or undisciplined. This shame isolates people, discouraging collective recognition of debt as a structural issue. At the same time, the stress of owing, of living under constant pressure to meet payments, keeps people compliant, less likely to take risks, speak out, or organize. Debt, in this sense, functions as both an economic tool and a form of social control. The irony is that while households struggle under the weight of debt, corporations and the wealthy use debt in an entirely different way. They leverage it strategically, borrowing at low interest rates to finance investments, expand businesses, or buy back shares. For them, debt is a tool of growth and accumulation. For ordinary families, it is a trap. This double standard reveals yet another layer of inequality. Debt enriches those at the top while impoverishing those at the bottom. When we pull back, it becomes clear that debt is not merely a financial arrangement, but a reflection of power relations in society. Workers, denied fair wages, are forced to borrow back the very wealth their labor created. Lenders positioned at the top of this cycle capture profits from the repayment. Debt is not just an outcome of inequality, it is one of its primary engines. The relationship between politics and economics in the United States is often presented as if the two spheres are separate, as though politicians merely respond to economic trends while businesses simply operate within the legal framework established by government. But in reality, the two are deeply intertwined, and nowhere is this clearer than in the way political institutions serve the interests of wealth rather than the needs of the people. What many citizens imagine as a democratic process responsive to the public is, in practice, a system structured to amplify the voices of corporations and the wealthy. This arrangement is not incidental. It is the outcome of decades of policy choices, lobbying, campaign financing, and judicial decisions that have entrenched corporate power at the center of the political process. One of the most direct ways wealth shapes politics is through campaign contributions. Running for office in the United States requires enormous sums of money. Candidates spend months, even years, raising funds, and those who cannot attract sufficient financial support rarely stand a chance of winning. In this environment, corporations and wealthy individuals have disproportionate influence. They can fund candidates directly, finance political action committees, and pour resources into media campaigns that shape public opinion. While ordinary voters may donate small amounts, the reality is that the bulk of campaign financing comes from the richest sectors of society. As a result, candidates enter office with obligations, not to the general public who cast ballots, but to the financial backers who made their campaigns viable. Lobbying extends this influence even further. Corporations and industry groups spend billions each year employing armies of lobbyists to influence legislation and regulation. These lobbyists write draft bills, meet with lawmakers, and ensure that policies reflect corporate priorities. For example, financial institutions lobby for deregulation that allows riskier speculation. Pharmaceutical companies lobby against drug price controls, and energy corporations lobby to block climate policies that would threaten profits. These efforts are not marginal. They shape the very architecture of policy. The revolving door between government and industry reinforces the cycle as former legislators and regulators are rewarded with lucrative private sector positions, while industry insiders take up posts in government, ensuring alignment of interests at every level. Judicial decisions have also tilted the balance of power in favor of wealth. The Supreme Court's ruling in Citizens United v. FEC in 2010 effectively removed limits on corporate spending in elections, treating financial contributions as a form of free speech. This ruling unleashed a flood of money into politics, further institutionalizing the idea that those with the deepest pockets should have the loudest voices. The result is a democracy in name, but in practice, a plutocracy where policy outcomes consistently align with the preferences of the wealthy. Studies confirm this, showing that when the interests of average citizens diverge from those of economic elites, it is the elites' preferences that overwhelmingly shape policy outcomes. The consequences of this political capture are visible across every major policy area. Tax policy, for instance, has consistently favored the wealthy. Over the past decades, top marginal tax rates have been slashed. Capital gains are taxed at lower rates than wages, and loopholes allow corporations to shift profits offshore. These changes are not the product of broad public demand. They are the direct result of lobbying and influence by those who stand to benefit. Healthcare policy similarly reflects corporate interests. Despite overwhelming public support for more affordable and universal health care, the system remains dominated by private insurers, pharmaceutical companies, and for-profit hospitals, all of which spend heavily to block reforms that would cut into their profits. Climate policy, too, is shaped by the same dynamics. Fossil fuel companies fund campaigns, sponsor think tanks, and lobby relentlessly to delay or water down legislation, even as the consequences of climate change grow more severe. This intertwining of wealth and politics produces a cycle that is extraordinarily difficult to break. Wealth buys influence. Influence produces policies that generate more wealth for the already wealthy, and that wealth is then reinvested into further political influence. Meanwhile, the majority of citizens are left with the illusion of democratic choice, but little real power to shape the outcomes that govern their lives. Elections may change the faces in office, but the underlying structure remains a political system designed to serve wealth. The human cost of this arrangement cannot be overlooked. Policies that privilege corporations over people translate into underfunded schools, inadequate health care, stagnant wages, environmental degradation, and the erosion of public trust in institutions. Citizens become disillusioned, participation declines, and cynicism spreads. The narrative that government doesn't work gains traction, which ironically strengthens the hand of those who argue for even less regulation and oversight, further empowering corporations. It becomes a self-fulfilling cycle of decline in which the failures of government are used to justify policies that make government even less capable of serving the public good. At its core, this is not simply a story of corruption or individual bad actors. It is a systemic issue, a political economy where wealth and power reinforce one another. Corporations are not merely economic entities competing in markets. They are political actors shaping the very rules of those markets. The wealthy are not passive beneficiaries of policy. They are active participants in crafting it. Understanding this reality forces us to confront a sobering truth. The political system is not malfunctioning. It is functioning as designed, channeling benefits to those with the means to influence it and maintaining structures that keep wealth and power concentrated at the top. History is filled with moments when societies reached breaking points, when inequality, exploitation, and systemic failures became so extreme that ordinary people were pushed to act. These moments remind us that crises, while painful and destabilizing, also create openings for transformation. The situation we face today, stagnant wages, rising debt, inflated costs of living, and political systems captured by wealth, fits into a long historical pattern. It may appear overwhelming, even insurmountable, but history suggests otherwise. When the contradictions of a system become too severe, when the suffering of the majority outweighs the privileges of the few, change becomes not just possible, but necessary. What we are witnessing today is not only a deepening crisis, but the conditions for a potential turning point. To understand this, we can look at earlier moments when ordinary people confronted entrenched power. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the United States faced massive industrial expansion alongside brutal working conditions. Workers labored for long hours in dangerous factories with little pay, while corporate titans accumulated unprecedented fortunes. Out of this inequality grew movements like the labor unions, the progressive movement, and eventually the New Deal reforms. Workers organized strikes, built solidarity, and forced the political establishment to address their demands. It was not generosity from the top that produced reforms like Social Security, unemployment insurance, or labor protections. It was pressure from below, millions refusing to accept the status quo, that created the possibility for change. Globally, similar patterns can be seen. In Europe after World War II, when devastation left millions impoverished and economies in ruin, strong labor movements and socialist parties pushed governments to rebuild on different terms. Universal health care systems, affordable education, and stronger worker protections were not gifts from elites, but victories won through collective struggle. Even in more recent decades, countries in Latin America have seen waves of political transformation where popular movements challenged neoliberal austerity and demanded redistribution, social programs, and greater democratic participation. These moments of transformation did not erase inequality overnight, but they demonstrated that when crises are met with organized action, they can become catalysts for real progress. The current crisis in the United States and much of the world is marked by many of the same dynamics. For decades, inequality has grown steadily worse. The top 1% has accumulated vast wealth while the majority struggles with stagnant wages, precarious jobs, and growing debt. This inequality is not hidden. It is visible in every community, every workplace, every paycheck. People see corporate executives rewarded with bonuses while employees live paycheck to paycheck. They see billionaires expanding their fortunes during global crises while ordinary households scramble to pay rent. These visible disparities create a sense of injustice that no amount of public relations or political spin can erase. What makes this moment particularly charged is that the suffering is widespread and collective. Inflation, debt, and job insecurity affect people across regions, industries, and even political affiliations. This shared experience of precarity has the potential to break down divisions and build solidarity. It can foster the recognition that the struggles faced by different groups, whether over health care, wages, housing, or climate, are interconnected, rooted in the same structures of wealth and power. Crises clarify these connections in ways that ordinary times often obscure. Of course, crises can also go the other way. They can be exploited by elites to consolidate even more power, to divide people through fear, nationalism, or scapegoating, and to reinforce the very systems that caused the crisis in the first place. We saw this after the 2008 financial crash, when banks were bailed out while millions of homeowners lost everything. Elites framed the crisis as too complex for ordinary citizens to understand, while quietly ensuring that those at the top were protected. The lesson here is that crisis alone does not guarantee transformation. It opens a door, but it is the actions of ordinary people, whether they organize, mobilize, and demand change, that determine what comes through that door. Challenge today is to recognize that the pain many are experiencing is not random or personal. It is systemic, and that recognition is powerful. When individuals realize their struggles are shared, they stop blaming themselves and start looking outward toward collective solutions. This shift in consciousness is the first step toward transformation. It is how despair can be turned into determination, and how isolated grievances can become a unified movement. The potential for such change is visible in the growing number of strikes, worker walkouts, and grassroots campaigns across the country. Nurses demanding better staffing, teachers striking for their students, warehouse workers organizing for safer conditions, All of these are signs that the recognition of systemic failure is translating into action. Each struggle may appear localized, but together they are building momentum, creating the possibility for broader transformation. History tells us that when people are pushed to their limits, they can, and often do, push back. The present crisis is deeper and more complex than many first realized, but that also means the potential for change is greater. The very severity of the crisis forces questions that might otherwise remain unasked. Why does the wealth produced by millions end up in the hands of so few? Why does the political system prioritize corporate donors over citizens? Why must families go into debt for health care or education in the richest country on earth? Asking these questions is the beginning of refusing the logic of the system, and refusing that logic is the first step toward transforming it. So let me close with this. Yes, this is worse than I thought. And the more we uncover, the more we see how deep the rot runs. But don't mistake clarity for hopelessness. To see the truth clearly is not a reason to give up. It is a call to action. We cannot afford to be spectators in this crisis. We must become participants in the struggle to transform it. And if history is any guide, that struggle is not only necessary, it is winnable. Thank you.